another episode of Vital Dissent. I am your host, as always, Patrick McFarlane. This one is episode 268. Show notes may be found at vitaldissent.com/268. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about the ICJ's ruling in the South Africa versus Israel genocide case on provisional measures. We're also going to be talking about other things ICJ. There was a ruling that came through today, I believe, on a Russia-Ukraine case. We're also going to be talking about Walter Block and Hans Hermann Hoppe and the open letter heard round the libertarian world that came out today. And I think, I'm trying to think, are we going to talk about anything else? I don't know. My goal for this episode is to keep it somewhat brief and not do quite as much of a deep dive on the ICJ stuff. However, there's some important analysis that I think I'd like to provide and clarify. So last Friday, the ICJ, I thought it was surreal because I didn't actually expect it to happen, although I thought it probably would happen. But the ICJ did rule that they would institute, or that it would institute, the provisional measures that South Africa was requesting, although it did stop short of basically calling for a ceasefire or ordering a ceasefire, which South Africa did request in its pleadings. And we're going to talk about exactly why. It's not surprising that the court did not order a ceasefire, even though a lot of people, a lot of analysis were kind of, a lot of non-legal analysis were kind of surprised and shocked and were dismayed that the court would not order a ceasefire, even though the ruling itself, like in order to comply with what the ruling was, Israel would have to cease fire in effect, because right, the relief requested by South Africa was that Israel immediately cease all killing of members of the group and causing serious mental and emotional harm to members of the group. While the only real way to comply with that would be Israel ceasing fire and ceasing military activity in its military campaign, what they would call a military campaign, but which in effect is a genocide or a plausible genocide as ruled and found by the ICJ. And we had a exchange with my colleague Kyle Ancelone had an exchange with Dave Smith. And this is no slight to Dave at all. I think I certainly understand the sentiment, and I think some of us had this sentiment. But he said, I see a lot of critics of Israel, who I respect very much, celebrating the ICJ ruling. It seems to me that they totally bitched out. Talking about the ICJ, they could have ordered an immediate ceasefire, and instead they told Israel to make sure that they don't do any more genocide and that they have a homework assignment due in a month. We all know this isn't going to change the Israeli approach to the war. I'm not seeing much of a victory here. Am I wrong? Now, I definitely understand this sentiment, and he's absolutely right. We all know this isn't going to change the Israeli approach to the war, right? I mean, the ICJ actually doesn't have any enforcement power at all, aside from, the parties that consented to the convention and passed the convention said they would submit themselves to the jurisdiction of the court for these kinds of proceedings. And the homework assignment due in a month, I think that's kind of funny, but it is, I think it's important that Israel be compelled to give a report on what their activity is and how they've tried to implement these measures, so that there can be no doubt in the future as to, I guess they can present a defense as to what they're doing or how they're complying. Maybe if we compel them to speak, we can hang them with their own words by cross-examining them on it, in a sense of what they say, the measures that they're undertaking. Maybe it would try to compel them to at least do less harm. But Kyle Ancelone, my colleague at the Libertarian Institute and at antiwar.com, the opinion editor at antiwar.com, and frequent guest of this show, says, I disagree for a few reasons. One, Israel was never going to alter its war plans based on the ICJ ruling alone. This is all about applying pressure to the White House to end U.S. support for Israel, which is the only real check on what Tel Aviv will do. I think that's right, and I think that the overall point of what this is, and I was thinking about writing an article about this, but I've been like just dying at work. But the importance of this ruling is that this provisional measures on last Friday might actually signal, you know how we don't know things. This was the thesis of the article I wanted to write. You know how we don't really know the importance of pivotal events until hindsight is 2020, and we know, oh, this was the turning point. I was going to make the case that the provisional order, the ruling, the institution of provisional measures by the ICJ might be one of those watershed moments where it's the high water, not necessarily the high water mark, but it is the momentum shift, the turning of the tide when it comes to the US and the West's international credibility. And when the rules-based, the global international rules-based world order officially crumbles in terms of its public perception by the global South or the other nations of the world. And again, I reject this framing necessarily of, the oppressed people, the colonizers versus the colonized, and maybe some of our more left-leaning friends or progressive anti-war, what do you want to say, compatriots, that they might try to frame it that way. I don't necessarily agree with that, right? We believe in property rights and the freedom of the individual and against collectivism. And that's why we support Palestinians, because of their, one, they have a right to their lives. Two, they have a right to their property and not to be oppressed and have their natural rights be squashed out by an apartheid government. But in terms of the turning of the tide, I think it's an incredibly important moment because the UN itself is forced to acknowledge, or else lose all credibility, that the same rules, that the West doesn't follow their rules-based world order. It's an official recognition of that fact. So, number two, Kyle says in his tweet, South Africa said that the ruling amounts to a de facto ceasefire. I think that is correct. I also think that is correct. If Israel were to abide by the ruling, they would have to end operations. Now, I posed this to Kyle in our group chat that theoretically Israel could possibly conduct their military operations with regard to civilian lives. And if they did, what would that look like? Is that even possible? I think it's a thought experiment. If you are in the shoes of the IDF and you're thinking about, okay, well, we do have these, if you reject the framing, right, that Israel has a right to exist, which I don't think Israel as a state has a right to exist because of, we went over that in detail on the episode, how Palestine became Israel, right? That the state itself, you need just acquisition of the land, traceable to people who hold legitimate title and property rights to the land. If you frame it that way, Israel doesn't have a right to exist. So I don't think that they have a right to self-defense on land, of course, their person, but not to the land that they don't have legitimate title to, that they can trace through Lockean, property rights means that they have legitimate title to the land. All that being said, if you reject that framing and you think Israel does have a right to defend itself, you think about how possibly Israel could conduct a counterinsurgency operation or some kind of targeted anti-Hamas military operation that would be like a scalpel without dropping, 2,000-pound bombs, flattening civilian infrastructure and homes and universities and culture centers and hospitals. You would think that there could be a possibility that they could go in, conduct targeted anti-terrorist operations. Again, not by sending their commandos into hospitals well dressed as doctors and nurses and civilians to targeted assassinate people in their hospital beds that they say are Hamas. But they could do, a legitimate military operation in theory. Could they? Thought experiment. Think about it. I don't think so, but maybe. So when he says if they were to abide by the ruling, they would have to end operations. Probably. All that to say. Number 3, Kyle says, Trita Parsi said, quote, "This is a devastating blow to Israel's global standing. To put it in context, Israel has worked ferociously for the last 2 decades to defeat the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions." I always think of BDSM when I read that. I don't know, Freudian slip maybe. Not because it will have a significant economic impact on Israel, but because of the manner that it could delegitimize Israel internationally. However, the ruling of the ICJ that Israel is plausibly engaged in genocide is far more devastating to Israel's legitimacy than anything BDS could have achieved. 4, the Genocide Joe protests are problematic for the re-election campaign. Before this ruling, half his 2020 votes and young Americans believed this was a genocide. This will only embolden the protesters. Drinking some Jameson tonight. Maybe that'll help me. 5, Biden has really centered his foreign policy on respect for the international order. The conflict between that and supporting Israel is too obvious. Dave responds, all fair points. That was awesome. Now, I had to chime in too, and I think Dave liked this response. On X, he hit the heart button. I say, from an egg-headed lawyer standpoint, aside from Kyle's crucial context, the court has never ordered a unilateral ceasefire in a genocide case before as a provisional measure. So it took me forever to fucking find this. I spent way too much time one morning, a work day, for my firm, a work day, trying to figure this out. Now, there really haven't been a lot of genocide cases that have been before the ICJ. I think 8 or 9, something like that. But the court does have the power to order a ceasefire, theoretically, because there is no actual precedent or statute limiting that as a provisional measure, a ceasefire. But they've never done it before, but there is no, there's no reason why they can't do it. There's no actual law or precedent or authority saying they can't do that. I say, even if such a ruling, so it does have the power to, even though that remedy is actually not in the Genocide Convention document itself, which gives the court the authority to prosecute or to hear these genocide cases. The court, however, did not order a ceasefire in the Myanmar or I think the Rohingya case. The Myanmar case was a couple years ago, and it did not order a ceasefire in the Bosnia and Herzegovina versus Yugoslavia cases, even though it did find that a genocide was plausible in both the Myanmar cases and the Bosnia and Herzegovina v. Yugoslavia cases. South Africa did not have much to say in its case about the ongoing acts of Hamas, and I'm sure that is where the court is hanging its decision not to go beyond precedent and order a unilateral ceasefire as requested by South Africa. So I quoted this Lawfare article by Mark Latimer, and I'll put this in the show notes page, but I linked to it in my response to Dave in reply to Kyle. Here's the operant section of this article. So the article itself is called "What Will the International Court of Justice Order on Genocide in Gaza?" This came out January 17th of 2024 in the Lawfare blog. There's a whole bunch of, it goes through everything that we went through in the past episode, but it has interesting commentary. So it says suspension of military operations. This is the big one. Jeez, I lost. Okay. This is the big one requested. This is the article I'm reading. This is the big one, but is unlikely to be granted. In Ukraine v. Russia, the ICJ ordered some 3 weeks after the February 24th, 2022 invasion that Russia, quote, shall immediately suspend its military operations in Ukraine and ensure that any military or irregular forces supported by it do likewise. But that case was significantly different from the Gaza case because it was not about whether Russia is committing genocide, but about whether Russia's military operation was a lawful response to Russia's allegation that Ukraine was committing genocide, right? Because there was an allegation by Russia after the 2014 Maidan revolution coup that Ukraine, the Ukrainian government, the newly installed coup government, attacked the areas of the Donbass. I'm forgetting, it's been a while since I've talked about Ukraine, but the two oblasts that have since seceded from Russia or from Ukraine and joined Russia, they said they were no longer a part of the government in 2014 after the coup. They weren't part of the coup government. They formed their own separate nations. They asked to join Russia at one point, but Russia said no. Well, Ukraine then launched a war supported by the United States against these flyaway oblasts, and Russia said that that was a genocide. So that's the context there. Christopher Staker for Israel elicited some surprise in the public gallery with his argument that in Bosnia and Herzegovina v. Yugoslavia, the court had not ordered military activities to cease as a provisional measure, quote, even though an ongoing genocide was said to be in progress. Rather more persuasive was his argument that such a measure would require, quote, unilateral suspension of military operations by one party to the conflict only, leaving the other side, that is Hamas, free to continue attacks, which it has a stated intention to do. This is the hole in South Africa's case that makes an order to suspend military operations doubtful. South Africa condemned the October 7th attacks and hostage-taking by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups, but it did not fully engage with the consequences of Hamas's continuing military operations, including rocket barrages fired at Israel. It was almost as if South Africa had decided with its lawyers, don't mention the war. Israel, by contrast, talked of little else, and it spoke the legal language of war, otherwise known as international humanitarian law, precautions in attack, warnings, military targets, confronting human shielding, and legal assessments of proportionality. South Africa was able to bring this case because of the compromissory clause in the Genocide Convention, which gives the ICJ jurisdiction to hear disputes between parties over the convention's application. Israel, however, argued that it was IHL, the law of armed conflict, that was the appropriate law for regulating the conduct of hostilities, including hostilities with an enemy that itself flagrantly violated that law, and that provided the proper framework for balancing military necessity with humanitarian considerations. So the next part, addresses like this analysis in hindsight, Mark Latimer's analysis from this Lawfare blog entry, this article, what will the International Court of Justice order on genocide in Gaza, was actually pretty on point, at least with that section that I read. Again, this came out before the ruling. And I thought that this was the correct take, I think, that the main reason why the court did not order unilateral suspension of military operations, maybe it would have ordered Israel to cease and Hamas to cease if South Africa had requested that. Now, they did say, the ICJ, it did say in its ruling that it could go beyond the request of the requesting party in order more than what was asked. Maybe it should have ordered that Israel and Hamas both cease fire. Maybe that is the correct and more accurate criticism that could be offered here. But maybe the court had good reason not to even go that far, because maybe it was convinced that at least a portion of the conflict was organized. Well, okay. Now, I don't think that Hamas actually is a party to the treaty. So maybe that's why it didn't feel like it had the authority to order Hamas to cease fire. And so it just avoided the issue at all. So those are all really interesting points, I think, to consider when you're thinking about whether or not it is a win for South Africa. I think it's an overwhelming win, even though there are these things about it, because one question when I really wanted to answer this, I think the operant question was, okay, South Africa did ask the court to order a ceasefire, but did the court ever have the authority and power to order a ceasefire? Because if they never had that authority, then it's not a loss for South Africa. But the fact that South Africa asked it and the court theoretically had the authority to, it does damper the victory a little bit, I think. However, the fact that the court is kind of overstepping precedent and that to order a ceasefire would have been unprecedented in a genocide case, I think means that it emboldens South Africa's victory, because they did ask for it, but no one's ever gotten it before. So the fact that they didn't get it necessarily isn't a loss to go there. Welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. The best way to do that, guys, is to go to libertyweekly.club. Yes, I haven't changed the URL yet, but this is my membership website that also functions as a newsletter. So if you go to that website, libertyweekly.club, hit the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, and you can subscribe for the free newsletter, and I send out a lot of free content. However, there is a section in those free emails that is premium, and that premium section includes early access to my episodes, access to bonus episodes, and preprints of my articles before they're published at the Libertarian Institute or other outlets. So again, go to the website, hit subscribe in the top right-hand corner, and sign up for that email list. You go through the page here and you can see all the content that I've set out in the past. There's a whole bunch of it, guys, and you get access to those previous emails that have gone out as well. Another way to help support me is to go to vitaldescent.com/stitchfix and sign up through my link there. You'll get $25 off your first order, and I will also get a $25 credit. Guys, I use this to buy my wardrobe. I'm a father of two. I have my own business. I do this, and I don't have time to go shopping. Can't haul the wife and kids around to have a leisurely shop for myself to pick these clothes. So what Stitch Fix does is that they pick the clothes for you. They send them to you in fixes, and it's really awesome stuff. These are all the pieces that I personally have bought myself. There's a lot of work stuff in there, but there's also casual stuff. I got an awesome plaid shirt that's in there, a flannel, really love that. I got this really cool sweatshirt. I got these awesome boots and a nice windbreaker, really good stuff. So go on over to vitaldescent.com/stitchfix. You can also get Vital Descent, really hard not to say Liberty Weekly, Vital Descent merchandise with the cool, awesome new logo from Mises Pieces. You can get all these kinds of things, all this merch. You got coffee cups, pint glasses, sweatshirts, premium t-shirts, premium sweatshirts, all that good stuff there at vitaldescent.com/merch. Also, guys, I started a TikTok channel, and I think that'll be really cool, trying to get more eyeballs on this content and more views. You can see it's already garnering a bunch of views, where I do anti-war cartoon reviews and a lot of cool stuff there. So vitaldescent.com/TikTok is where you can find me. My handle is at @PatMcFarlane_, the same as my Twitter handle. Okay, guys, that's about it. Check out those things. Please help support this content. Help me pay my producer and make the show better for you guys. Thanks. All right, 21 minutes in. I want to cover the most recent article from Mark Latimer, Friday, January 28th, 2024. And again, Mark Latimer, Lawfare is not a libertarian outlet. They do cover foreign relations and international law. Like, I would suspect that they're more establishment, which probably means more hawkish. But I think that, Mr. Latimer had, I assume maybe he's an attorney. Let's look at his profile. He's an executive director of Ceasefire Center for Civilian Rights. His books include The Gray Zone, Civilian Protection Between Human Rights and the Laws of War. I should read that. So I don't want to assume anything about Mark Latimer. I don't know him. I do get the impression that lawfare is more establishment, but I don't know for sure. So definitely look into that. Let's look at about. Just peruse this quick. It's a nonprofit multimedia publication dedicated to hard national security choices. Nonpartisan, timely analysis of thorny legal and policy issues through our written content. I was trying to look. Like, it doesn't say if they're part of some kind of a think tank or something like that. Oh, so it's with the Brookings Institute. So that tells you what you need to know, or some of it at least. But I have appreciated Mark Latimer's his take on this so far. I haven't seen anything that I'd like objectively disagree with, or am like mortified by or disgusted with. He says the International Court of Justice's interim measures to prevent genocide in Gaza is the title of the article. The court has in effect ordered that what the U.S. has been pushing for all along. The U.S. should now support compliance. Well, I don't know if I agree that the U.S. has been pushing for it all along, but let's see. Maybe in some sparse rhetoric, but not in action. The catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip is at serious risk of deteriorating further, said John Donahue, president of the International Court of Justice, reading out the court's order in South Africa via Israel. Quote, in view of the fundamental values sought to be protected by the Genocide Convention, the court considers that the plausible rights in question in these proceedings, namely the right of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip to be protected from acts of genocide and related prohibited acts under the convention, are of such a nature that prejudice to them is capable of causing irreparable harm. The interim order by the ICJ in the case brought by South Africa requires Israel to take provisional measures to prevent acts of genocide and ensure humanitarian access to the population of Gaza, but refrain from ordering a suspension of military operations. It contained a few surprises for habitual watchers of the court, but in the main followed the precedent established in other cases, including the Gambia v. Myanmar, which we talked about just briefly, a few minutes ago and in the last episode. So he does the recap, which we don't need to go over, right to what the ICJ ordered. 6 provisional measures. There was a high degree of consensus among the judges, with all measures attracting only 1 or 2 dissents, including those from the ad hoc judge appointed by Israel. First, the court required Israel to take all measures within its power to prevent the commission of all acts constituting the physical elements of genocide, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberating, inflicting conditions of life, calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, and imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group in relation to the Palestinians in Gaza. Considerable space earlier in the ruling was given to itemizing effects on the Gazan population that broadly correlated with these elements. Now, I have heard some people say that the court went through and stated as fact a lot of the alleged facts by South Africa, and some people have said that the amount of time that the court spent going through and reciting these and maybe finding as fact these alleged statistics about mortality rates and things like that was unprecedented and probably is very well for South Africa's case. I have heard that. I don't know to say that necessarily. Quoting extensively from UN officials, the court outlined the public health disaster unfolding, including an expected rise in maternal and newborn death rates due to lack of access to medical care. Second, the court ordered Israel to ensure with immediate effect that its military does not commit any of the genocidal acts, underscoring the responsibility of the state of Israel for all acts of the IDF. Third, Israel should prevent and punish direct and public incitement to commit genocide. The court specifically drew attention to statements by Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, in which he said, I have released all restraints by the Israeli president and by then Minister of Energy Israel Katz, who said, quote, all the civilian population in Gaza is ordered to leave immediately. We will win. They will not receive a drop of water or a single battery until they leave the world. The latter probably constitutes the first time the ICJ has ever quoted a tweet. Interesting. The ICJ did not quote Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's references to the biblical slaughter of the Amalek by the Israelites, which Israel had suggested in the oral proceedings had been misinterpreted. Israel's counsel did not explain how, but an exploration of that argument can be found here, so he links to that. However, the contested significance of such statements for proving genocidal intent will only really be tested at the merits stage. Remember, because the case is going forward, this is just a provisional ruling, which is due to take place some 3 years hence when the current military operation will be long over. God willing. It is one thing to argue, as Israel did, that inflammatory statements by senior officials were driven by emotion and not reflective of official policy when the outcome of operations, while devastating, is still uncertain. It is quite another thing to try and make that argument when some of the conduct urged, such as the mass expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza, may have come to pass already. It is notable that this measure on preventing incitement was also supported by the ad hoc judge appointed by Israel, former Israeli Supreme Court President Aaron Barak. Barak also supported the ICJ's fourth provisional measure, which is that Israel take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address the adverse conditions of life faced by Palestinians in Gaza. This goes beyond the measures indicated in the Gambia v. Myanmar case. So that is interesting. That is a win for South Africa. In placing an absolute duty on Israel to enable humanitarian assistance, irrespective of the absence of a deliberate calculation to bring about group destruction. It also goes beyond the strict framework of the Genocide Convention. It sweeps aside, too, the efforts of Israel's coordinator of government activities in the territories to lay the blame for failures in ensuring humanitarian access on UN agencies. So that's interesting because subsequently, the EU, I believe, or European nations and the US have condemned the UN, UNRWA, I think it's called, agency because they're alleging that some employees, like 13 of like 13,000, it's a very small number of employees, Israel and the West have alleged that they were working with Hamas in some capacity that is not quite certain. Even though UNRWA immediately took action to terminate these people, they have pulled all funding from the UN aid relief agencies because of that. So this ruling is interesting. This part of the ICJ ruling is interesting. The ICJ, in its fifth and second to last order, the ICJ reverted to the Myanmar case formula for its fifth provisional measure, preventing the destruction and ensuring the preservation of evidence relating to allegations of genocidal acts, and also its sixth provisional measure requiring Israel to report back to the court on all measures taken to give effect to the order. Here, however, the court laid down a deadline of 1 month. For Myanmar, it was 4, so this is expedited, reflecting both the urgency of the situation and the court's determination that its order should have an immediate effect. Rhetorical reactions aside, Israel will have to decide quickly to what extent it will continue to engage with the proceedings before the ICJ in a process characterized by Itamar Man as, quote, counter-genocidal governance. Israel's determination to avoid the charge of genocide from sticking may itself motivate stronger controls both over the public statements of officials and over the destructive effect of military operations on the Gazan population. Interesting. It may itself motivate stronger controls both over the public statements of officials, so they're going to try and put a muzzle over their people. Maybe. Wishful thinking. Or is it? I don't know. I don't know how to interpret that paragraph. Let's read it again. Sorry, it's been a long day. Rhetorical reactions aside, Israel will have to decide quickly to what extent it will continue to engage with the proceedings before the ICJ. Well, I don't know. Does that mean that they're just not going to show up and they're not going to like mount their own defense? So in a process characterized by Itmar Man as counter-genocidal governance, Israel's determination to avoid the charge of genocide from sticking may itself motivate stronger controls both over the public statements of officials and over, like, they're going to try and hide their genocidal activities harder. What is this? Social legal perspective on litigating the crime of crimes. Noting that the impact of the process is already evident and any provisional measures that may be given will shape a years-long and likely tense dialogue between Israel and the court, as well as third countries. One of the fundamental insights of law in society is that the significance of legal process often outweighs its outcome. Pay attention to this aspect of criminal procedure. The current process in The Hague is not criminal, nor is punishment due. Unlike the ICC's prosecutor's investigation, it is at least a theory not directed towards individuals or towards shaping their behavior. Yet, for better or worse, it will do exactly that. The basic insight on the primacy of process may apply here as well. Unlike the ICC, it is at least in theory not directed towards individuals or towards shaping their behavior. So it will, like, the very fact that this is happening is going to shape people's behavior, right? Maybe does that mean that they're going to be hiding their genocidal acts? So after hearing South Africa's arguments, many lawyers, including myself, speculated that even if the provisional measure is granted, the likelihood of Israel being held responsible for genocide at the end of the day is small. You don't need a crystal ball to say that, observed this person. Ultimately, however, time is precisely what will tell. To assess the merits phase appropriately, it's essential to remember that the court cannot press a button, freeze the current situation, and issue a judgment based on what we know. Everything that will happen for the duration of the proceedings over the next 2 or 3 years at least will continue to build evidence until finally the owl of Minerva will spread its wings. So I think, so he's not saying that. I don't think he's necessarily saying, this is a different article that was linked, by the way, by Itmar Mon, trying to figure out what the hell Latimer is trying to say in this paragraph and what he means. I think it's essentially that, like, it is, and I've talked about this in my my coverage of the Chinese, the Uyghur Xinjiang province Uyghur genocide allegations, that I don't think that there's a case that genocide is being committed against the Uyghurs. And I actually, personally, I don't think that a genocide is taking place there. But saying that it's taking place and actually proving it in court according to, like, the Genocide Convention are kind of two different things. And I think that this Itmar Mon, that we have his article pulled up here, it is incredibly hard to prove a genocide case to the ICJ. I don't have statistics in front of me about, like, how many of the cases have gone forward, but I know that, like, overwhelming evidence is required, and not just, like, quality of evidence, it's the volume of evidence that is required too, that, like, this is a mass intent of a state to exterminate people throughout government. So it would be hard to prove, but also they're saying that, yeah, the fact that this proceeding is going on is probably going to affect the behavior of Israelis, the IDF, the Israeli government, and either hiding their acts or making it harder to track or making them be more careful about their genocidal intent or things like that. Back to the Latimer article, but the question of compliance is not just one for Israel. Laying down specific obligations for the prevention of genocide in Gaza, the court has also effectively laid down a challenge to states, the US and UK principal among them, whose supply of arms and material support to Israel's military operations could engage their own liability for aiding and assisting genocide or the separate offense of complicity in genocide. Pressure is already building in Congress about why arms transfers to Israel have not been subject to Leahy law controls. Now, again, there's a process when the United States and Kyle Anzalone and Dave DeCamp have covered this specific, like, problem that they're talking about here, that when the U.S. transfers arms to another country, there is an internal process that the United States makes sure that the recipient of the arms at least outwardly, according to their own internal process, is not engaged in gross human rights violations. Now, Israel has special status when it comes to this, that there's a special process that only, as far as I understand, that I've heard from their reporting, that there is only, that Israel has a special ability to argue certain events. Like, so if Israel is accused of shooting Shireen Abu Akleh in the face while she's wearing a press vest, covering Israel's crimes, that Israel gets to have their first say in its own defense about what happened. Well, it's not completely like an independent third-party review by the United States. That's what they're talking about. What the court did not order, unlike in Ukraine v. Russia, the ICJ declined to order an immediate suspension of military operations. South Africa's counsel had argued that the rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza was such that only such a suspension of operations could halt the slide to mass deaths from hunger and disease. However, as I pointed out previously on Lawfare, we just read that, such a measure was always improbable given the asymmetric nature of the current proceedings, with the court having jurisdiction over only one party to an ongoing armed conflict. Yeah, that's what I said. Although it could not be part of the operative part of the order, the court found it necessary to, quote, emphasize that all parties to the conflict in the Gaza Strip are bound by international humanitarian law, and said that it was gravely concerned about the fate of the hostages, calling for their immediate and unconditional release. Neither did the court order Israel to grant access to fact-finding missions and independent mandates as requested by South Africa. In its it missed an opportunity to link its order with a separate investigation ongoing at the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which covers not just alleged crimes committed by the IDF and Palestinian armed groups in the territory of Gaza and the West Bank, but also alleged crimes committed by Palestinian nationals in Israel. I should cover this on the show. The state of Palestine. This is an ongoing case from 2014. Wow. Okay. So my purpose in this post is to provide. Oops. Sorry. Wrong article. More generally, the ICJ avoided prejudging the case on the merits by issuing any commentary on key issues, including on Israel's right to defend itself and on which constellation of genocidal statements by officials and patterns of conduct on the ground could meet the burden of proof for genocidal intent. This is a well-written article by Mr. Latimer, I think. So what happens now? I mean, we already kind of talked about that. I'm kind of running out of time here. So this is what he says, though, that I might not agree with. In the U.S. interest, South Africa's application to the ICJ has served to crystallize world opinion on the conflict, leaving the U.S. and a handful of Western states looking heavily isolated. Coming just a year after the U.S. worked hard to muster global opposition to Russian operations in Ukraine, accusations of double standards are intensifying. To an extent, the U.S. has always been insulated from such criticism, but in European capitals, the complaints are heard loud and clear. More concretely, at the start of IDF operations, the United States' priority was to prevent escalation into a wider regional war. 3.5 months in, hostilities have escalated on a second front, with Hezbollah in Lebanon, with Israel making preparations for an invasion, reportedly. A third front has opened with Ansar al-Allah, the Houthis in Yemen, and dozens of American personnel have been injured in renewed attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria. The U.S. administration needs a way out. The ICJ may just have thrown it a lifeline. Yeah, maybe they'll take it. I mean, I do remember some things that Antony Blinken was saying about urging restraint to Israel and saying that we don't want it to escalate into a wider regional war. However, I think, if you just go to antiwar.com and you'll see that some of that might have happened, but I think with its actions, the United States has completely allowed this to escalate and to continue, and has been, I guess at the very least, completely unable to rein in, Benjamin Netanyahu and the IDF in Israel in what they're doing, and have, aided and abetted the process. We'll say that. So briefly, haha, briefly, I wanted to cover this. Kit Clarenberg, I just came across this tweet. This was today, January 31st, 2024. You probably haven't heard, he says, but the ICJ today threw out almost all the case brought against Russia by Ukraine over the invasion. Quote, clearly a victory for Russia, France 24 reports. He says, yeah, which is why the Western media is saying nothing about it. I just wanted to cover this because I watched the video that Kit Clarenberg links to. And as far as I can tell, and respectfully to Kit, because he does great work, as far as I can tell, this is not the ruling. He's right that it was a good day for Russia in the ICJ, but the case was not necessarily over the invasion. It's not the one that we were talking about, Ukraine v. Russia in the ICJ. This is actually a case that precedes Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I'll try, this is a 3.5 minute video. I don't want a copyright strike. But this is, ICJ says Russia violated parts of UN anti-terrorism treaty. So you can see this, and I don't want a copyright strike on this video. So I'll just pull up what they're actually talking about. Ukraine was claiming that Russia was financing terrorism in eastern Ukraine, saying only that Moscow would, the ICJ said only that Moscow had failed to investigate alleged breaches. So this is, where the hell did I put that? So this is the actual ruling from today. It's the judgment of January. You can't read it on the screen, sorry. In the corner, it says judgment of 31st January 2024. The present proceedings were instituted by Ukraine following events which occurred from early 2014 in eastern Ukraine and in the Crimean Peninsula. The situation in Ukraine is very different today than it was when Ukraine submitted its application in January 2017. So, with regard to this, the applicant instituted proceedings relating to the events in eastern Ukraine, alleging that the Russian Federation failed to take measures to prevent and suppress the commission of offenses of terrorism financing. So they're saying because Russia financed the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic militaries, that they were engaged in terrorism. So that does not refer to the, as I think Kit suggests in this tweet, at least my reading of it, it doesn't refer to, and I'm not trying to call him out specifically, but I had to look into this because this is a big victory for Russia. But you can see it's financing of terrorism and of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And if you go through the table of contents, they talk about the clean hands doctrine. They don't talk at all about the invasion, basically, in terms of the actual applicable ruling of the court. And again, this predates the invasion. So that aside, 15 minutes left until we hit the hour. Huge shockwaves went across the libertarian world today because Hans Hermann Hoppe issued a scathing open letter to Walter Block over Walter Block's position, and the editorials that he wrote in the Wall Street Journal supporting the IDF's military action against Palestine. So here's a tweet by our illustrious leader, Scott Horton at the Libertarian Institute, our director there. You can also find, I should mention this more, you can find this show, Vital Dissent, featured at the Libertarian Institute. I am the Justin Raimondo Fellow at the Libertarian Institute. Head on over to libertarianinstitute.org/donate to support our work. Scott says, Lou Rockwell and Hans Hermann Hoppe kick Walter Block right the hell out of the libertarian movement for being, quote, an unhinged, bloodthirsty Zionist monster and a very bad arguer. quote from Hans Hermann Hoppe, "The Murray Rothbard I knew would have immediately called Block's arguments out as unhinged, monstrous, unconscionable, and sickening, and publicly ridiculed, denounced, quote, unfriended, and excommunicated Block as a Rothbardian." So this is incredibly sad. Like, I don't revel in this at all, in a sense. I think I do agree with it, of course. And I think it's very important for the movement, because there have been members of the movement, not necessarily high-profile members of the movement, but there have been members of the movement the libertarian movement, who have been pro-Israel, openly so. And I think it's crucial that the leading living libertarian intellectual, Hans Hermann Hoppe, issues this letter saying what the definitive, Rothbardian libertarian position is on this issue. But it is sad. I have respect for Walter Block. I don't respect his position on Israel, and I think it's wrong and not libertarian. He also had some positions that I covered on this show. I think with Asarchist, we reviewed an article that he wrote in the Journal of Libertarian Studies, I think, about the libertarian response to COVID-19. And his scholarship, I don't think, was great. I don't think his arguments were great. Maybe his scholarship was fine, but his arguments weren't great. I don't think that they were libertarian. I don't think they were the correct libertarian argument. But I think his position and basically advocating for genocide, as Hans Hermann Hoppe says, does kind of disqualify him, and then arguing for it in the Wall Street Journal. And he wrote a book that Benjamin Netanyahu endorsed. So it is sad. I do think that on better days, Walter Block is a huge asset to the libertarian movement. He's responded. I emailed him, and I know that he tirelessly will answer emails from anyone, and he will actually put time and energy into it, and give you sources, and look at your papers and read them and give you feedback. And I think that shouldn't be discounted. I do think that as a person, as far as I've known, Walter Block has been incredibly nice, incredibly personable, approachable, generous with his time and energy and mental effort. And he's a prolific scholar and has just, in terms of written an obscene amount of works that have contributed to the libertarian movement. So it does sadden me to see this. But I don't know. I think that this is such an important issue now, and we'll see how this will escalate over the next, months, the next year, see what happens. And maybe this might be, it's not enough to be right. You have to be right at the right time. And Walter Block is wrong at exactly the most crucial time, I think. So Hans Hermann Hoppe writes, an open letter to Walter E. Block. Breaking up with a person you've known for more than 30 years, with whom you've participated in countless conferences and co-authored a couple of articles, even if only in the somewhat distant past, is nothing done lightly. It is even harder if one shares with this person a common standing as a public intellectual, and both our names are mentioned frequently in one breath as prominent students of the same teacher, Murray Rothbard, and as leading intellectual lights of the modern libertarian movement founded by Rothbard. So it is important that this is published on LewRockwell.com, right? But then in this position, it becomes near imperative to always stay on guard and take notice if a person closely associated with your own name goes astray and falls into serious error, and you may be compelled to publicly distance and disassociate yourself from this person in order to protect your own personal and intellectual reputation. Along with Rothbard's and that of the entire libertarian intellectual edifice, such as the case with Walter Block. Again, to his credit, he's published countless articles that pass muster by libertarian standards, and there are likely many more to come. He's effusively praised Rothbard over and over again, and he likes to refer to himself as, quote, the sweet and kind Walter, which He is, in my experience. However, he has also published materials that clearly disqualify him as a libertarian and Rothbardian, and that reveal him instead as an unhinged collectivist, taken in by genocidal impulses, very much like Rand and the Randians, recently taken to task by Fernando Chioca, rather than a sweet and kind person. That's dismaying. I will offer 3 exhibits to substantiate this claim. I mean, Hoppe is correct about, I believe about his substantive claims. Here are the 3 exhibits, and I'll just briefly go over them before we say goodnight. Exhibit 1, Block's writings, all together with Alan Futerman, sorry, mispronounce, and Rafi Faber on the classical liberal, respectively libertarian case for Israel, endorsed, surprise, surprise, by Benjamin Netanyahu. And so Hoppe goes through this in detail, and I'll link so you can read in detail what the issue is with Block's arguments. Basically I read through it this morning. A lot of things happened between then and now, but basically that the only way that you can acquire property is through, either homesteading it or receiving title from someone who's justly acquired that property. Hoppe says that you can't substantiate Block saying that the Israelis collectively have a right to the land because you can't individually trace titles back 2,000 years and actually do it in a way that makes sense. It's lost to history, whereas the Palestinians actually have a traceable right that you can demonstrably so that you can demonstrate. Hoppe says, the claim of present-day Jews to a homeland in Palestine then can only be made if you abandon the methodological individualism underlying and characteristic of all libertarian thought, the notion of individual personhood, of private property, private product and accomplishment, private crime, and private guilt. Instead, you must adopt some form of collectivism that allows for such notions as group or tribal property and property rights, collective responsibility, and collective guilt. So he quotes Block, goes through it. Exhibit 2, this is a recent editorial by Block, again co-authored with Futterman, my apologies. Originally most predominantly published by the most establishment papers, the Wall Street Journal, and subsequently easily accessibly reprinted on Block's own newsletter on October 12th, 2023, entitled The Moral Duty to Destroy Hamas. Israel is entitled to do whatever it takes to uproot this evil, depraved culture that resides next to it. And as the title already indicates, it is this screed of his, then, that reveals Block as an unhinged, bloodthirsty monster rather than a libertarian committed to the non-aggression principle as the second complementary foundational pillar of the libertarian doctrine. So Hoppe says, and this is important, what is the libertarian opinion on October 7th? First, the libertarian must recognize that both Hamas and the State of Israel are gangs financed and funded not by voluntary membership contributions, but by extortion, taxation, confiscation, and expropriation. Hamas does so in Gaza. I'm just kind of going through. Israel is much larger, significantly more prosperous, and less densely populated territory in the State of Israel, subsidized long-lastingly and heavily by the world's mightiest and wealthiest of all gangs. The USA is a big and high-budget gang with some large, well-trained professional army. I don't know, are they professional? Some of them are conscripts. Whatever. State of Israel is the older one. Hamas, on the other hand, is made up of one of several Arab resistance movements formed. Basically says, first off, libertarians want to wish the pox on the leadership of both gangs and on all gang leaders of foreign states that have lent and continue to lend support to either one of the two warring gangs with funds stolen from their own populations. As well, we would acknowledge that the Hamas attack on Israel was no more totally unprovoked than the Russian attack a little while ago on the Ukraine. The attack on Israel was definitely provoked by the conduct of its own political leadership, much like the Russian attack on the Ukraine had been provoked by the leadership of the Ukraine, and he would not fail to notice also that in both cases, that of Israel as well as that of the Ukraine, their provocations had been encouraged, backed, and supported big time by the predominantly Jewish neocon gang leadership in charge of the US government. Apart from this, there is little a libertarian can do except raise his voice in favor of peace, talks, negotiations, and diplomacy. What must be avoided, however, in any case and at all costs, is an escalation of the armed conflict through a massive retaliatory strike by the Israeli military against the Hamas housing and hiding out in Gaza. This even more so because of Israel, with some 10 million inhabitants, including minority of some 2 million Arabs, is surrounded exclusively by some less than friendly or even openly hostile neighboring states with a total population counting in the hundreds of millions. And any escalation of the conflict may well expand and degenerate into an all-out war engulfing the entire region of the Near and Middle East. But this is precisely what Block et al. Are demanding. Leaving Block's sketchy, characteristically one-sided remarks on the history of modern Israel and the region aside, which could have come directly from the Israeli Ministry of Propaganda, that show himself completely oblivious to the genocidal impulses openly expressed by several leading members of the mighty Israeli military and government, all the while making much hay out of the reciprocal sentiments on the side of the, comparatively speaking, almost powerless Hamas leadership. This, in this own words, are Block's demands. Goes through this, yada, yada, yada. The West needs to understand that to defend human life and dignity, it isn't enough to claim to side with Israel. It needs to understand what this means. Total unrestricted support. Interesting. Yeah, that's crazy. That's crazy, Walter Block. And Scott kicked him out of, on a Tom Wood Show episode, Scott kicked Walter Block out of Libertarianism, I think a couple months ago. Anyway, the third exhibit is Block's reply to a short piece by Kevin Duffy, contrasting a passage taken from Rothbard's For a New Liberty with a passage from the just quoted screed of Block's in the Wall Street Journal, and concluding that both are obviously incompatible and impossible to reconcile. Yeah, so, sorry, Kevin Duffy responded to Walter Block, his article in the Wall Street Journal, and Kevin Duffy responded by quoting Rothbard's For a New Liberty, and then Block replied to Kevin Duffy's reply to Block's Wall Street Journal article, and Hoppe says that disqualifies Walter Block. And I'm not going to go through what is the last little bit here? But this call for total and unrestricted war and the indiscriminate slaughter of innocent civilians is actually the complete and uninhibited rejection and renunciation of the non-aggression principle that constitutes one of the very cornerstones of the Rothbardian system. To believe that Rothbard would have given serious consideration to his Wall Street Journal piece is simply ridiculous and only indicates that Block's understanding of Rothbard is not nearly as good as he himself fancies it to be. The Rothbard I knew would have denounced the piece in no uncertain terms as monstrous and considered it an unforgivable aberration and disgrace. So go through and read all of Hans Hermann Hoppe's reply. I mean, this is a huge moment in the history of modern libertarianism, I think. And depending on what happens from here, I don't know. I don't know what'll happen. This is probably definitely the end of Hans Hermann Hoppe and Walter Block's scholarly relationship and their appearance at conferences together and doing those kind of things. I mean, Walter Block might be, some people might still associate themselves with him. I don't know. I do think it is too bad. It is very sad. It is too bad. I hate that Walter Block has taken these positions. I try to give him credit where it's due. Also recognize that he is a tremendously nice and personable person, but this position just is not reconcilable. Maybe Walter Block will have a response. In fact, I suspect that he will. But it is too bad. It's just very sad, actually. And I hope that, I wish that Walter Block would reconsider his position but probably not. We'll see it. We'll see. But I just wish the best to everyone. But I emphatically would side with Hans-Hermann Hoppe. And of course, agree with Scott that this is disqualifying as well. So, okay, well, I hope that today's episode was entertaining and enlightening. vitaldescent.com/268 for the show notes page. I will try and get another episode out next week. My sister is getting married, so I'm not working, and we'll be doing that on Thursday and Friday. The wedding's on Friday, so we're going to that. And got a really busy week of work next week, lawyer work. So consider supporting this work. Really do appreciate it. libertarianinstitute.org. Peace.